March 19, 1945. The island of Iwo Jima groaned under the thunder of naval guns and the howl of aircraft. Sulphurous ash drifted across the jagged terrain as if the earth itself was bleeding smoke. Beneath the shattered volcanic rock, hundreds of Japanese soldiers crouched in narrow caves, rifles poised, eyes burning with resolve. They had carved their fortresses deep into the island's bones, believing themselves untouchable, hidden from the merciless firepower above. Yet, outside their labyrinth, the ground trembled with an unfamiliar rhythm. The sound was not artillery, not tank treads. It was a slow, guttural hiss, the hiss of fuel being primed. Moments later, an orange tongue of flame erupted across the cave's mouth. The air ignited, stone walls glowed like a furnace, and the laughter the Japanese once carried when told of America's strange new weapon, an ungainly, fuel-spewing contraption strapped to the backs of infantrymen, vanished into screams drowned by the roar of fire. The flamethrower was not subtle. It did not sneak across the battlefield like a sniper's bullet, nor thunder like a naval bombardment. It was visceral, immediate, a living element weaponized by engineers who had learned that bullets could not smoke out men buried in volcanic tunnels. In the suffocating dark of those caves, oxygen turned traitor, sucked away by liquid flame. The Japanese had once scoffed, calling it clumsy, calling it impractical. They said no man could walk into the kill zones of rifles and machine guns carrying such a bulky burden. But in those final, desperate battles of the Pacific, as Marines advanced inch by inch over sand blackened with blood, the flamethrower became something else. It became terror incarnate. The Marines carrying these tanks of death walked forward, with the weight of 35 pounds strapped to their backs, steel cylinders brimming with gasoline thickened into gel. A trigger, a nozzle, and a spark turned it into a dragon. At first, Japanese observers laughed at its short range. They saw the flames sputtering only 20 or 30 yards and dismissed it as a novelty. But when those fire streams curved into caves clinging to stone and skin alike, laughter turned to silence. The flame did not simply burn, it consumed, crawling over walls, rolling into the deepest tunnels. A man could not hide from it. He could not dig deep enough, nor fight air that itself had turned to fire. By the time the Marines reached Iwo Jima, the Japanese had perfected underground warfare. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had ordered the construction of nearly 11 miles of interconnected bunkers, pillboxes, and tunnels, all designed to bleed the Americans white. Machine guns were hidden behind steel shutters. Artillery fired from invisible shafts and then vanished back underground. Every ridge bristled with snipers and mortars that could not be silenced by bombardment alone. Naval guns fired for days, blasting the island into a moonscape. Yet when the smoke cleared, the defenders still lived. They were ghosts in the earth, and they waited. The Americans soon learned that only one weapon could truly dig them out. Picture a Marine squad moving cautiously through the blasted landscape. The volcanic ash swallows their boots. Black dust clings to their sweat-soaked uniforms. Ahead, a bunker slit flashes with the muzzle fire of a Nambu machine gun. Rifle rounds ricochet off rock, and grenades fall useless against walls of concrete reinforced with rebar. The squad halts. Then, from behind their line, a figure steps forward, a heavy steel cylinder gleaming in the sunlight. The flamethrower. Operator lowers his wand-like nozzle, squeezes the trigger, and a river of fire surges into the opening. In an instant, the silence inside the bunker is replaced by a deep, guttural roar. Men who had once sworn to fight to the death feel heat claw at their lungs before bullets can even chamber. Smoke pours out, thick and oily. The gunfire ceases. A cave that had been an impregnable fortress seconds earlier has become a crematorium. The psychological weight was as devastating as the physical destruction. For the Japanese, the cave was sacred. It was a womb of steel and stone, a place where the enemy's artillery could not reach. But once flames touched it, that sacred sanctuary became a trap, a tomb that closed in with unbearable heat. Reports from survivors tell of men clawing at their throats, suffocating before fire even touched them. The gel used in these weapons clung to surfaces, crawling over sandbags, rifles, and skin. Attempts to smother it only spread the blaze further. In those suffocating tunnels, laughter at America's clumsy weapon curdled into pure dread. And yet carrying the flamethrower was no easy task. The Marines who bore it knew they painted targets on their backs. Japanese defenders quickly learned to single them out, unleashing torrents of fire on any soldier with the heavy tanks strapped to his shoulders. Every step forward was a gamble with death. Yet they advanced anyway, knowing their squad's survival depended on them. Many did not live to tell their story. Those who did often recalled the smell, the acrid stench of burning fuel mixed with the grim reminder of what fire did to human flesh. Some never forgot it. Some never spoke of it again. On Iwo Jima, caves, once seen as untouchable shrines of defense, were reduced to fiery coffins. On Okinawa, entire ridges lit up like torches under the relentless hiss of napalm and flame. The Japanese High Command, once dismissive, grew desperate. They issued orders to kill flamethrower operators at all costs, but by then, it was too late. The tide of the Pacific had turned. The island strongholds that had once mocked American firepower crumbled not to battleships or bombers, but to a man walking forward with a tank of fuel and a spark at his command. The lesson was brutal. War had always been about fire. Fire from muskets, fire from cannon, fire from bombs. But now fire itself was sculpted, controlled, directed with surgical intent. The battlefield became not just a clash of arms, but a contest of willpower against the most primal fear mankind knows. The Japanese soldiers laughed once. They laughed at the awkward silhouette of the weapon, the heavy cylinders gleaming like toys in the Pacific sun. But when the caves glowed orange, when the volcanic rock itself seemed to breathe flame, no laughter remained. Only the silence of caves turned into graves. June 1944. The Pacific Ocean boiled with fleets the size of floating cities. Thousands of ships, carriers, and transports pushed westward, island by island, as the United States tightened its noose around Japan's empire. The strategy was relentless, an amphibious leap from coral atolls to volcanic ridges, stripping away Japan's outer defenses one bloody landing at a time. But behind the sweeping maneuvers and grand fleets, the war devolved into something intimate and brutal. It became a fight for yards of ground, for the mouths of caves, for tunnels carved into the heart of every island. On these claustrophobic battlefields, doctrine, training, and technology collided in a way no one had anticipated. By 1943, the American military machine was awakening in full. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, its factories producing tanks, ships, planes, and weapons at a pace the world had never seen. On the seas, American carriers dominated. In the skies, bombers reached deep into enemy territory. Yet on the ground in the Pacific, the struggle was something older, something more primitive. The Japanese army, seasoned by years of conquest in China and fortified by an iron code of Bushido, embraced a doctrine of absolute resistance. Every soldier was expected to fight to the last, to transform every cave, every ridge, into a final stand. Surrender was unthinkable. This fanaticism created a new kind of battlefield, one where an entire island could be turned into a fortress, and where conventional weapons often fell short. The Pacific Islands themselves became complicit in the slaughter. Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each was a natural fortress of rock, coral, and jungle. The Japanese exploited this terrain with ruthless ingenuity. Engineers hollowed mountains, carved tunnels, and linked bunkers into underground cities. Artillery pieces were hidden inside volcanic shafts, sliding into view only long enough to fire, before vanishing back into darkness. Machine guns fired from slots so narrow they were nearly invisible. Snipers climbed trees or disappeared into spider holes, emerging only when Marines advanced within feet of their positions. To an invading force, the land itself seemed alive with fire and death. For the Americans, this was a nightmare. Amphibious landings brought waves of men under withering fire, but once they established a beachhead, the real struggle began. How do you root out an enemy you cannot see? How do you fight men who vanish into rock and reappear behind your lines? Artillery and naval bombardments could pulverize the surface, but beneath it the enemy endured. Shells collapsed tunnels, yes, but for every buried position, 10 more survived. Reports from Saipan describe Japanese defenders re-emerging from rubble hours after the heaviest barrages, their weapons still functional, their will unbroken. American commanders studied the problem with growing urgency. This was not Europe. In France, Germany, and Italy, mobility mattered. Tanks could maneuver, artillery could dominate open fields, and air power could devastate supply lines. In the Pacific, on islands smaller than American counties, battles shrank to claustrophobic contests fought yard by yard. Firepower had to be immediate, personal, and absolute. The solution arrived in the form of an old idea reborn with modern engineering: portable flamethrowers. It was a weapon as ancient as man's fear of fire, but now refined for industrial war. Soldiers could carry it on their backs, directing liquid flame into bunkers and tunnels. Unlike grenades, which exploded and were done, fire lingered. It crawled. It suffocated. It found men who thought themselves safe. And so the doctrine began to shift. Marine Corps manuals were rewritten to incorporate flamethrower units alongside rifle squads. Engineers were trained to wield the weapon not just as a tool of destruction, but as a methodical instrument of clearing bunkers one by one. The Japanese at first refused to take it seriously. Their doctrine was rooted in endurance and courage. To them, fire was a nuisance, not a decisive weapon. They trusted their caves, their concrete, their rock, and their determination to hold. In the early encounters on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Japanese officers reported flamethrowers as little more than clumsy contraptions, dangerous for the operator and of limited range. They underestimated not only the weapon, but the psychology it carried. By 1944, the Americans had refined their approach. Flamethrower operators were no longer isolated. They were integrated into assault teams, protected by riflemen and supported by engineers carrying satchel charges. A typical advance on a Japanese position became a deadly ballet. Riflemen pinned down defenders. Flamethrower operators advanced under covering fire, and when the cave mouth or pillbox was within range, fire did the rest. Satchel charges followed, sealing tunnels with collapsed rock. It was slow, deliberate, and costly, but effective. This shift in tactics revealed a fundamental mismatch between the two sides' doctrines. The Japanese believed in static defense, in building fortresses and relying on courage to hold them. The Americans, learning through blood, embraced flexibility and combined arms, where every weapon, rifle, grenade, flamethrower, demolition charge, played its part. What began as desperation on Guadalcanal hardened into doctrine by Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and within that doctrine, the flamethrower became indispensable. The year 1944 marked a turning point. On Saipan, Marines confronted some of the most elaborate tunnel systems yet encountered. Entire companies disappeared into the earth, firing from unseen apertures. For days, progress stalled. Then came the flamethrower. Teams advanced cave by cave, clearing positions not by volume of fire but by certainty of destruction. Reports noted that caves once considered unassailable were emptied in minutes when fire was applied. Soldiers described the effect in grim detail. The flames consumed oxygen, suffocating defenders before the fire itself reached them. It was war stripped of distance, war reduced to a struggle between men in the same suffocating space. By the time Okinawa loomed on the horizon, both sides knew what was coming. The Japanese had perfected their defenses, building an underground world designed to inflict maximum American casualties. But the Americans came armed not only with overwhelming numbers and firepower, but with lessons hard-won on earlier islands. They knew flamethrowers would play a central role. For the Japanese, laughter faded into dread. What they once dismissed as a clumsy weapon had become their most feared enemy. This was the Pacific War at its core, not vast tank battles, not sweeping maneuvers, but an intimate, brutal confrontation fought over feet of ground, through tunnels of fire and smoke. It was a war where doctrine clashed with necessity, and where survival demanded a new kind of weapon, born of both engineering and desperation. The stage was set, the caves were waiting, and the Americans, carrying fire on their backs, were ready to walk into the darkness. September 15, 1944, Peleliu. The sun baked the coral ridges into white-hot stone as Marines pressed forward under a blistering sky. The Japanese had been watching, waiting, hidden in a network of caves that honeycombed the Umurbrugol Mountains. When the Americans advanced, the defenders unleashed their fury. Machine guns from unseen apertures, mortars hidden under camouflage, snipers who seemed to appear and vanish like ghosts. The battlefield was a nightmare of heat, dust, and sudden death. Yet amid the chaos, a new sound emerged, a low, sinister hiss. A Marine crouched, lifted a long wand-like nozzle, and pulled the trigger. What burst forth was not lead or shrapnel, but a river of fire, liquid and alive. It poured into the mouth of a cave, clinging to rock, rolling inward like a tide. The defenders screamed, their fortress of stone betrayed by the very element they had ignored. This was the moment the hidden advantage revealed itself. The weapon the Japanese had laughed at now reigned as the most feared on the battlefield. At first, the Japanese dismissed the flamethrower as impractical. Their soldiers derided it as a novelty, a dangerous toy for the Americans to burden themselves with. They believed its limited range and bulky tanks made operators easy prey. Their doctrine taught them that courage and concealment would overcome such a crude device. But as the campaigns in the Pacific ground forward, the laughter turned hollow. Reports from the front told of entire positions wiped out in seconds, not by artillery barrages or bombing runs, but by a single man carrying fire on his back. The flamethrower had revealed its hidden power, not in scale but in intimacy. It was a weapon designed not to kill from afar, but to reach into the sanctuaries where no bullet could follow. The secret lay in its nature. Machine guns could be silenced, grenades could be dodged, artillery could be endured in bunkers. But fire was different. Fire crept into corners. It consumed oxygen. It turned safety into suffocation. Defenders who once believed themselves invulnerable behind layers of rock and steel shutters now found their strongholds transformed into ovens. Even when flames did not reach them directly, the heat and smoke drove them from hiding. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers discovered that courage alone could not shield them. Their doctrine of static defense was unraveling in the face of a weapon as old as humanity and as terrifying as hell itself. The American commanders understood what they had. Flamethrowers were not just weapons, they were psychological sledgehammers. A cave defended by a dozen fanatics could stall an entire platoon. With a flamethrower, that same cave could be neutralized in less than a minute. Marines advancing on Saipan and Guam reported a transformation in morale. The dread of invisible gunfire from caves was replaced by grim confidence. They knew the weapon could silence even the most determined defenders. For the Japanese, the effect was the opposite. Survivors of flamethrower attacks described panic, spreading faster than the flames themselves. Soldiers abandoned positions, fled tunnels, or committed suicide rather than face the fire. This hidden advantage was not limited to its destructive power. It was also its adaptability. The Americans refined their tactics, combining flamethrowers with demolitions to devastating effect. A typical assault followed a grim choreography. Riflemen suppressed the defenders, flamethrowers drenched the cave in fire, and engineers followed with satchel charges to seal the survivors inside. Each step magnified the psychological toll. Japanese soldiers quickly learned that even if they survived the initial flames, there would be no escape. Fire was followed by burial. Their laughter at American clumsiness had given way to the realization that the weapon was not just practical, but unstoppable. And yet, the Japanese never truly countered it. Their doctrine was too rigid, their resources too strained. They tried to target flamethrower operators, issuing orders to kill them at all costs. But operators rarely fought alone. Rifle squads shielded them, artillery suppressed defenders, and tanks often carried mechanized flamethrowers that belched fire with even greater range. The Japanese had built their strategy on the belief that caves and bunkers could withstand anything. They discovered too late that fire respected no walls. The hidden advantage also lay in the American willingness to embrace innovation. While the flamethrower was not new, versions had been seen in the First World War, its integration into infantry tactics was revolutionary. Where the Germans had used it sparingly in Europe, the Americans made it central to Pacific warfare. Engineers refined the design, improving range, reliability, and portability. Factories turned out thousands of units, each one a handheld inferno. By the late war, flamethrowers were no longer experimental. They were doctrine. For the Japanese soldier crouched in a cave, the realization came too late. He had once laughed at the sight of a Marine burdened with heavy tanks. He had once believed his fortress of stone was impregnable. Now, as the hiss of fuel turned to the roar of fire, he understood. The hidden advantage was not in the size of the weapon, but in the terror it carried. It stripped away illusions of safety, pierced through walls, and reached into the very earth itself. It revealed a new truth about war. Sometimes the most feared weapons are not the largest or the loudest, but the ones that can turn the strongest defenses into the weakest prisons. By the time the Americans reached Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the lesson was clear. The flamethrower was no novelty. It was the answer to the problem of caves, tunnels, and fortresses carved from rock. The Japanese had mocked it, underestimated it, and dismissed it. But in the end, it was fire that consumed their defenses, fire that broke their will, and fire that turned laughter into silence. The flamethrower was not born in the jungles of the Pacific. Its story began decades earlier, in laboratories and factories where engineers grappled with the age-old challenge of turning fire into a controlled weapon. The Germans had first unleashed crude versions in the First World War, bulky contraptions that spat short-lived bursts of flame across muddy trenches. They were heavy, unreliable, and dangerous to their own operators, but the concept lingered. By the 1930s, as nations armed for a new global conflict, American engineers revisited the idea with fresh eyes and modern industry behind them. What emerged was not a clumsy relic of the trenches, but a sleek, deadly tool of war, the M2 flamethrower. The device was deceptively simple in appearance: 2 steel cylinders strapped to a man's back, connected by hoses to a nozzle that resembled a long metal wand. But inside it was a feat of wartime engineering. Each tank carried a mixture of gasoline thickened into sticky gel. The fuel was pressurized by nitrogen, ready to be expelled in a torrent when the trigger was pulled. At the nozzle's tip sat an ignition system, initially powered by magnesium cartridges and later by safer spark systems. The result was a controllable stream of fire that could reach 20 to 40 yards depending on wind and conditions. For an enemy soldier peering out from the darkness of a cave, it meant no refuge was safe. Numbers tell part of the story. The M2 weighed around 35 pounds when filled, a crushing burden for the Marine who carried it across volcanic sand or coral rock. Each tank provided only 7 to 10 seconds of flame in total, delivered in short bursts. A single operator had to choose carefully when to fire, for every drop of fuel was precious. Yet those few seconds carried the power of an artillery barrage in confined spaces. The gel clung to surfaces, igniting wood, cloth, and flesh alike. Oxygen vanished in an instant, replaced by choking smoke. Engineers tested and refined the design constantly, aware that every improvement meant more Marines survived the deadly business of cave clearing. Factories across America turned these designs into reality. Companies like Colfax and the Chemical Warfare Service oversaw production, with assembly lines in Detroit and Chicago churning out thousands of units. Each flamethrower contained hundreds of components, carefully tested to ensure reliability under the most punishing conditions. Spare parts were issued by the crate, and manuals drilled operators on every aspect of use, from cleaning valves to recharging nitrogen. It was industrial war at its finest, precision engineering in the service of primal destruction. Yet the flamethrower's story was not only one of infantry. Tanks, too, were fitted with mechanized versions. The M4 Sherman became the chassis for devastating flame tanks, its 75mm gun sometimes replaced or augmented with a projector that could spew fire hundreds of feet. These mechanized flamethrowers extended the reach of firepower far beyond what a man could carry, allowing entire cave systems or jungle bunkers to be saturated in flame. Marines called them Zippo tanks, a grim nod to the cigarette lighters they resembled. To Japanese defenders, their arrival meant doom. A tank's armor made it nearly invulnerable to small arms fire, and its flame projector could bathe whole ridges in burning fuel. Where infantry flamethrowers were limited, the tanks brought industrial-scale fire to the battlefield. The science behind the weapon fascinated as much as it horrified. The thickened fuel, often mixed with napalm by the later stages of the war, represented a revolution in chemistry. Napalm, developed at Harvard in 1942, gave fire a new persistence. Unlike gasoline, which burned hot but fast, napalm clung to whatever it touched, burning longer and more intensely. Rocks glowed red under its heat. Steel warped. In the confined tunnels of Iwo Jima or Okinawa, The effect was apocalyptic. Defenders could not extinguish it, nor escape it. The weapon turned geology itself into an accomplice, using stone walls to reflect and magnify its fury. Technical specifications underscored its deadly efficiency. The M2's flame could reach temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to incinerate anything organic within moments. Its ignition system could function even in heavy rain, and its pressurization allowed operators to spray fuel in arcs or short bursts, controlling the spread like a painter guiding a brush. Range tests showed the weapons stream could penetrate bunker slits barely wider than a fist, delivering fire deep into interiors. Japanese records revealed astonishment at its accuracy and persistence. They had expected something crude. Instead, they faced a weapon that seemed almost surgical in its ability to reach them. Behind the weapon stood its inventors and the vast machinery of American production. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, chemists refined napalm mixtures, while engineers tested prototypes in concrete mock-ups of Japanese bunkers. Reports from the field fed back into design adjustments, stronger seals, lighter harnesses, improved igniters. In this cycle of combat and innovation, the flamethrower evolved into a tool perfectly suited for the Pacific theater. It was the embodiment of American wartime adaptation, a nation willing to harness fire itself to solve the problem of caves. But the weapon carried a terrible burden for its operators. They knew the tanks on their backs could explode if hit by enemy fire. They knew their silhouette marked them as prime targets. Many flamethrower men did not survive their first battles, and yet they carried on, driven by duty and by the knowledge that their weapons saved the lives of their comrades. Marines often spoke of flamethrower operators with a mix of respect and pity. They were essential, but they bore the heaviest risk. Some would later recall the feeling of the trigger in their hands, the surge of heat, the scream of pressurized fuel igniting. For many, it was a memory they carried long after the war ended. In the cold language of engineering, the flamethrower was a marvel of wartime science. A 35-pound assembly of steel, fuel, nitrogen, and spark, capable of projecting death in a liquid stream. In the brutal poetry of war, it was something more. It was the dragon unleashed, the ancient terror of fire given form and precision. The Japanese had once mocked it. But in the tunnels of the Pacific, when the walls themselves seemed to glow and air turned to flame, the mocking ended. Fire had proven itself not just a weapon, but the ultimate counter to stone, steel, and stubborn will. September 12, 1944, Lorraine, France. The fields near the village of Aracourt lay shrouded in morning fog as German panthers crept forward, their engines growling like predators stalking unseen prey. Across the fields, American Sherman tanks waited, their silhouettes faint shadows through the mist. For the Germans, confidence ran high. They had faced Shermans before, knew their armor was thin, their guns inferior. But this day would not unfold as expected. As German commanders ordered the advance, their formations suddenly faltered. From the American lines came not just cannon fire, but coordinated movement, rapid responses, uncanny communication. Platoons shifted positions as if guided by a single hand. Orders echoed instantly, and tanks maneuvered with startling cohesion. German crews, veterans of the Eastern Front, found themselves bewildered. Their opponents moved with a speed and clarity that defied experience. They had assumed superiority. Instead, confusion took root. Something invisible was shaping the battle. Something hidden. The clash at Aracourt was not merely about tanks and guns. It was about communication, about the unseen threads binding men together in the chaos of combat. Radios, once considered a convenience, had become the decisive edge. While German tanks often relied on limited sets, with commanders alone in contact, American Shermans bristled with radios in every vehicle. Orders could be relayed instantly. Platoons could coordinate ambushes, shift fields of fire, or disengage with precision. To German crews, accustomed to shouting orders through vision slits or waving flags under fire, the effect was devastating. They faced not just tanks but an organism, a single body with many guns moving as one. But in the Pacific, the hidden advantage revealed itself differently. On Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where no tank battle could decide the outcome, the flamethrower emerged as the American answer to Japan's fortress warfare. The advantage was not speed of communication, but mastery of terrain. Japanese doctrine depended on caves, tunnels, and underground strongholds. These bastions were meant to negate America's artillery, to nullify its tanks, to bleed its infantry white in close combat. Yet the flamethrower turned that doctrine into a liability. Where once a cave was a sanctuary, now it was a trap. Where once a tunnel was protection, now it was a coffin. At Iwo Jima, the hidden advantage flared to life in the hands of ordinary Marines. February 23, 1945, just miles from Mount Suribachi, fire teams advanced toward a ridge honeycombed with bunkers. For days, naval guns had pounded the ridge, yet still the defenders fired, their machine guns raking the beaches with unrelenting fury. Then came the flamethrowers. Step by agonizing step, operators closed in, their escorts laying down covering fire. At 20 yards they fired, streams of liquid fire rolling into the slits. The ridge that had withstood naval shells for days fell silent in minutes. Marines pushed forward. Survivors emerged screaming from the inferno, only to be met with rifle fire. Others never left their caves. The Americans moved on, leaving behind smoking stone. The numbers told the story. At Iwo Jima, the Japanese garrison numbered over 21,000. Nearly all fought to the death. Marines lost almost 7,000 dead and more than 20,000 wounded in just over a month. Yet without flamethrowers, the cost would have been higher still. General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith later remarked that flamethrowers and demolitions were the only reliable way to clear the island's defenses. The hidden advantage lay not in overwhelming force alone, but in the ability to counter the very terrain itself. Okinawa pushed this truth even further. There, Japanese defenders burrowed into the Shuri Line, an elaborate system of caves, tunnels, and ridges stretching across the island. American forces assaulted the line for weeks, battering it with artillery, naval bombardment, and airstrikes. Yet the defenders endured, sheltered deep in limestone caverns. Once again, the flamethrower revealed its worth. Reports described Marines advancing cave by cave, using flame and satchel charges in grim, methodical sequence. Whole hillsides erupted in fire as mechanized flamethrowers, Sherman Zippo tanks, joined the fight, their projectors hurling streams of fire hundreds of feet. Survivors spoke of ridges glowing red in the night, as if the island itself had caught fire. For the Japanese, the psychological toll was immense. The Bushido Code demanded resistance to the death, but flamethrowers stripped away illusions of honor in defense. Soldiers suffocated in darkness, burned alive, or were sealed within collapsing caves. Their once proud fortifications became symbols of terror. Diaries recovered from the dead spoke of dread, of men praying not to die by fire. They had once laughed at America's strange contraption, calling it clumsy and unworthy of a warrior's respect. But as the campaigns wore on, laughter gave way to silence. Even German observers, far removed from the Pacific, noted the weapon's impact. Intelligence reports filtered back from Japan's allies, describing the flamethrower as particularly devastating against cave systems. German engineers who had dismissed similar weapons as niche realized too late that in certain environments, fire was absolute. But it was not only the enemy who felt the weight. American Marines too bore scars from the weapon they carried. Operators recalled the unbearable heat, the fear of being targeted, and the memories of what fire did to human beings. It was an advantage born of necessity, but purchased at terrible cost. The hidden advantage of the Pacific War was not glamorous. It was not the sleek speed of a fighter plane or the thunder of a battleship's guns. It was the hiss of fuel under pressure, the roar of ignition, and the sight of fire crawling into places where no bomb or shell could reach. It was the answer to the caves that had defied every other weapon. And in that answer lay the turning of battles that might otherwise have consumed far more American lives. In the end, the hidden advantage of the flamethrower was not just its power to kill. It was its power to break the doctrine of the enemy, to turn his strongest fortresses into his greatest vulnerabilities. What the Japanese had mocked, what they had dismissed, became the very weapon that unraveled their defense. And in that cruel irony, the battlefield was transformed. The battlefield was never just a contest of weapons. It was a contest of minds, of machines, of morale. By the spring of 1945, both sides in the Pacific knew this truth all too well. The Americans had embraced the flamethrower not only as a weapon, but as a doctrine. The Japanese, entrenched in their caves and tunnels, had discovered that their proud defenses could be turned into prisons of fire. And in this collision, The impact went far beyond the immediate destruction. It altered strategy, morale, and the very psychology of war. For Japanese soldiers, the cave was once sacred. It was a symbol of endurance, of survival against overwhelming odds. In their doctrine, caves and bunkers were places where courage could outlast firepower, where the spirit of Bushido could withstand the storm of steel. But once the flamethrower came, those sanctuaries betrayed them. The same stone walls that shielded them from artillery now trapped heat and smoke. The same tunnels that promised invisibility now became conduits for fire. The psychological weight was crushing. Soldiers wrote in diaries of their terror, not of bullets, not of bombs, but of fire. They prayed to die quickly, before the flames reached them. Survivors of flamethrower attacks often emerged broken, coughing, blinded by smoke, their will shattered long before their bodies fell. It was more than death, it was humiliation. They had laughed at the weapon. Now it consumed them. For the Americans, the impact was the opposite. The flamethrower, though feared by those who carried it, became a symbol of hope for the squads that advanced behind it. A single operator could silence a position that might otherwise kill dozens of Marines. Platoons learned to move with confidence when a flamethrower man was in their ranks. Reports from Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima noted the same pattern. Morale lifted when fire was on their side. Soldiers knew they had a tool that could root out the hidden enemy. They advanced not with ease. No battle in the Pacific was easy, but with grim determination that the caves could be conquered. Fire gave them certainty in a war of shadows. Strategically, the weapon reshaped campaigns. At Iwo Jima, General Holland Smith insisted that flamethrowers and demolitions were essential to the battle plan. Artillery and naval bombardments had failed to dislodge the defenders. Only flame could do it. Marines advanced methodically, pairing flamethrowers with explosives to clear every cave. The Japanese doctrine of attrition, of bleeding the enemy in protracted defense, collapsed in the face of this approach. On Okinawa, the story repeated itself. The Shuri Line, the most formidable Japanese defensive system of the war, relied on caves and bunkers. For weeks it held, but once mechanized flamethrowers, Sherman Zippo tanks rolled forward, the line began to crack. The Japanese discovered that courage and concealment could not withstand fire projected hundreds of feet into their strongholds. Entire ridges that had once seemed untouchable lit up like funeral pyres. The psychological duel extended beyond the battlefield. Propaganda spread tales of flamethrowers' horror. Japanese soldiers were told to target operators at all costs, even to sacrifice themselves in suicidal charges to silence them. But this very desperation betrayed the fear the weapon inspired. American intelligence noted the shift, how enemy units would sometimes break when faced with flame, how officers dreaded its appearance more than artillery or air power. Fire was primal, and in the Pacific it became the embodiment of American inevitability. Yet the burden was not one-sided. For the Marines who carried flamethrowers, the cost was immense. They knew they were marked men, singled out by defenders who recognized the tanks on their backs. They bore the constant fear that a single bullet might ignite their fuel, turning them into torches. Many carried their weapon knowing they might not return, and those who did survive often carried scars deeper than flesh. The memories of what fire did, to caves, to stone, to men, haunted them long after the war ended. Some spoke of the smell, unforgettable, of burning fuel mixed with human screams. Others refused to speak of it at all. The flamethrower gave life to their comrades, but at the expense of their own peace. On a grander scale, the weapon reshaped how generals thought about assault and defense. Before the flamethrower, fortifications were considered nearly impregnable if built into solid rock. After, commanders recognized that no position was safe. The doctrine of static defense, so central to Japanese strategy, was undermined completely. Even the most elaborate bunkers could be neutralized, not with massive bombardments, but with a single man and a spark. The psychological message was clear. Fire turned the strongest fortress into the weakest tomb. This effect carried into the minds of civilians as well. Photographs and newsreels from the Pacific, carefully censored but impossible to suppress entirely, hinted at the weapon's terrible power. Stories filtered back to the home front of caves reduced to ashes, of defenders who never re-emerged. For American audiences, it was proof of ingenuity and determination. For Japanese civilians, Whispers of fire fed into an already growing fear of the enemy's technological edge. When flames consumed the caves of Okinawa, they foreshadowed the firebombings of Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, cities that would burn as easily as bunkers. The line between battlefield and homeland blurred, and fire became the symbol of inevitable defeat. The strategic and psychological impact of flamethrowers was not measured only in destroyed caves or silenced bunkers. It was measured in morale, in doctrine, in the will of armies. The Japanese had once built their strategy on endurance, on the belief that courage and concealment could overcome overwhelming numbers. The flamethrower shattered that illusion. For the Americans, fire became a weapon of certainty in a war of uncertainty, a tool that gave them the edge in battles where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. It was not glamorous. It was not noble. But it was decisive. By the war's final year, the laughter that once greeted America's flame units had long since died away. What remained was silence. The silence of caves gone dark, of defenders consumed, of fortresses turned into tombs. The flamethrower had proven itself not just as a weapon of destruction, but as a weapon of psychology. It broke bodies, but more importantly, it broke beliefs. It showed that even the deepest sanctuary could become a trap. And in that revelation, the course of the Pacific War shifted irrevocably. August 1945. The Pacific War neared its end, yet the memory of flame lingered on the volcanic sands, in the limestone ridges, and in the scorched caves where thousands had once hidden. The flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a brutal truth. In modern war, no fortress is absolute, no sanctuary immune. Its legacy reached far beyond the tunnels of Iwo Jima or the hills of Okinawa. It reshaped doctrines, influenced future conflicts, and etched itself into the collective memory of soldiers and civilians alike. The Japanese soldiers who had once mocked America's flamethrower units left behind diaries, letters, and testimonies that revealed their transformation. Early entries brimmed with confidence, scorn for the bulky tanks strapped to Marines' backs, derision for the short range of their flames. But later notes told of despair. Men described suffocating heat, the horror of comrades burned alive, the futility of hiding in caves that became ovens. Bushido had taught them to die with honor, but fire stripped even death of dignity. It reduced the proud warrior to ash and silence. That psychological wound endured long after the fighting ended, a reminder that in war, fear could be as decisive as bullets. For the Americans, the flamethrower became both a triumph and a burden. It had saved lives by breaking the stalemate of cave warfare, yet it had scarred those who wielded it. Operators returned home with memories they could not erase. The sight of tunnels glowing red, the sound of screams cut short by fire, the smell that clung to their uniforms long after the flames had died. Many never spoke of it. Others admitted that, though they had carried the weapon proudly in war, they despised it in peace. And yet, history recorded their role as essential. Without them, battles like Iwo Jima might have consumed even more American lives. In military academies, their sacrifice was studied, their tactics recorded, their burden acknowledged. Strategically, the lesson was profound. The flamethrower proved that technological innovation could unravel even the strongest defenses. Caves and bunkers, once thought impenetrable, had been undone by chemistry, engineering, and courage. After the war, military planners carried this lesson forward. During the Korean War, American units again deployed flamethrowers against dug-in positions. In Vietnam, flame tanks and napalm carried the doctrine to jungles and tunnels, where once more the enemy had sought refuge in terrain. The principle remained unchanged. In close, confined combat, fire was the ultimate equalizer. But the legacy extended beyond battlefields. The Cold War, with its doctrines of deterrence and network-centric warfare, echoed the flamethrower's lesson. Strength was not just in firepower, but in the ability to neutralize the enemy's advantage. Just as flames stripped the Japanese of their caves, so too did radar strip bombers of invisibility, or satellites strip armies of secrecy. In modern war, connection and innovation outweighed brute force. It was not always the biggest gun or the heaviest armor that prevailed, but the weapon or technology that transformed the enemy's strength into weakness. The flamethrower also foreshadowed the darker side of war's evolution. Its psychological terror, its ability to erase not just men but morale, anticipated weapons of even greater destruction. Civilians who once watched islands burn in newsreels would soon watch entire cities incinerated from the sky. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more in a single night than either atomic bomb that followed. In those smoldering ruins, the same principle applied. Fire stripped away the illusion of safety, leaving only ashes. The flamethrower was the microcosm, the battlefield equivalent of that apocalyptic truth. For Japanese survivors, the memory endured into the post-war years. Veterans spoke of the caves not as fortresses but as tombs. They recalled the terror of waiting in darkness, listening for the hiss that signaled their doom. The laughter that once greeted reports of flamethrowers seemed obscene in hindsight. It had been arrogance born of ignorance, destroyed by the roar of flame. For American veterans, too, the memory lingered. They remembered comrades who died carrying the heavy tanks, targeted by snipers, cut down before they could fire. They remembered the mixed relief and horror when flame cleared a bunker, granting them ground at the cost of unimaginable death inside. In reunions and memoirs, the weapon was spoken of sparingly, as if its presence still carried the heat of old fires. The world moved on, but the weapon's shadow remained. By the 1970s, most armies phased out flamethrowers, deeming them too inhumane, too unwieldy in an era of precision-guided munitions. Yet the legacy of their effectiveness was never forgotten. The principles they embodied, using chemistry and engineering to solve tactical stalemates, wielding psychological fear as a weapon, endured. Modern thermobaric weapons, fuel-air explosives, and incendiaries carry the same essence. Fire harnessed to deny the enemy sanctuary. The dragon had not vanished. It had simply changed form. And so the story closes not on a battlefield but on a lesson. The flamethrower was never the mightiest weapon of the Second World War. It did not win campaigns by itself, nor did it dominate headlines like the atomic bomb. But in the caves of the Pacific, it was decisive. It revealed that victory was not always about the largest guns or the thickest armor. Sometimes it was about finding the enemy's illusion of safety and turning it against him. Sometimes it was about wielding the most primal element of all, fire, not as chaos but as control. The Japanese soldiers laughed once when they first saw America's flame units burdened by their heavy tanks and awkward nozzles. But war is a cruel teacher. Their laughter was silenced by the roar of flames in the caves of Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The legacy of that silence echoes still. It tells us that in war, arrogance can be fatal, that no fortress is beyond reach, and that the most ancient fears can be reborn through the engines of modern war. In the end, the flamethrower's story is not just about fire, it is about truth. The truth that no defense is perfect. The truth that innovation can turn weakness into strength. And the truth that in war, as in life, laughter can die in an instant, consumed by flames that leave behind only silence.